Hey friends, welcome to class 4 of the crease pattern tutorial series. Now, class 4 is all about introduction to 22.5 crease patterns. And so we're going to be breaking down what makes a crease pattern 22.5. We're going to cover some of the basics, and then the end goal will be to have this guy, which is a cute little lizard designed by Mark Thompson, who gave us permission to use this design for these videos. We're going to be making the base of it. The shaping will happen in the shaping class, which is class 5. So basically hang on to your base as we'll be getting to this guy later. And yeah, we're going to be covering as much as we can. This is going to be a very comprehensive class, maybe a little bit intense. We got some different structures to go over. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the whole series, this is where your background and experience in origami will come in handy. And if you need to refresh on some basic parts of origami, like your preliminary bases and your basic folds, then that will come in as well. So especially if you need to practice like your sync folds or just, reverses, closed sinks, outside reverse folds, any of those types of sorts, definitely practice that if this seems difficult, or if anything I say seems too much. We're not going to do anything crazy in this class, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. I hope this kind of breaks down how to approach 22.5 degree crease patterns without really brute forcing it, how to find reference points, and how to identify the different structures that are very different kind of than box pleat. But yeah, let's get started and let's start folding. So this first part of class 4 will mainly be describing different topics and concepts. However, we are going to be folding parts of this crease pattern right here, and it's pretty simple. You've probably done this many times in diagrams, but in case you haven't, I just want to show how to collapse. This is like a quad bird base, or just a sequence to go into it, so you have an idea of what to do. We'll get into the quad bird base later towards the end of the video, but to start off, this class, as it's like the intro to 22.5, we'll be covering 22.5 crease patterns that are mainly designed based off of preliminary bases, or that the designer used bases to design off of. So for example, this guy, the little lizard by Mark Thompson, this is like what you would call the collapsed base, but you could kind of see different forms of the water bomb base before you do any of these other creases. It's just stretched out to the side. Obviously, this one is straight up like just 4 bird bases, which ultimately stems from a blitzed water bomb base. So again, if you don't know what those terms are, I'll like briefly cover it, but go look in your origami books at the front page. Every origami book has the intro, folds and whatnot. They might not have like blitzed water bomb, but as long as you know what a water bomb base is, or the preliminary square base, you'll be good to go. But yeah, so all the crease patterns we are showing here are designed using the kind of design with a base mentality. The other forms of 22.5 you'll see it's a little bit more difficult in terms where you'll get more asymmetric designs, or like really off axis 22.5 degree molecules. We're not going to worry about that really in this class. We might get to it later, but if you want to find some examples, go to Robert Lang's website, or kind of any really complex crease pattern you can find, and try to see if it matches up with any kind of preliminary base. But yeah, with that said, let's start talking about what it means to see a crease pattern designed off a base. All right, so let's start talking about what it means to, I guess, start from the base with these designs. So unlike box pleat crease patterns where you pre-crease everything and then the collapse makes sense as you go off the grid and then all the pre-creases you made and you have all your different structures, your ally stretches, whatnot. 22.5 design is much more traditional in the sense that there's almost always a folding sequence behind it or a folding sequence to achieve it. Again, not always the case, but generally the case, you'll find it like this, which is why most diagrams are not box pleated, and the ones that are pretty much just do the crease pattern. So in this sense, right, we have our preliminary base, or this is the water bomb base, and then if we invert it, we get our preliminary base. This is, very standard basic we use in origami. And as you can notice, we have our water bomb, diagonals are mountain, the other ones are valley, and then inverted, it's the horizontals are mountains, diagonals are valley for the preliminary base. So you can use this to really identify where this happens in crease patterns. And while the crease pattern shown might not have all the creases that fit to exactly this throughout the whole paper, you can kind of assume like, oh, this is where it starts off from. So for example, we have here, if I kind of put this like right here, you see we have valleys. It changes a little bit here because we have an outside reverse fold, but essentially you can see that, oh, right here, we kind of collapse this in as or we can kind of start it off similar, very similar to the preliminary base. We change it a little bit. It kind of swaps between, but you can almost see that if I open it up here, what it looks like. So these are just some different approaches you can take to kind of see what needs to be done first, or just to start recognizing structures, which we'll go over in the next couple parts, especially for this one. But what's easier to see right now is just to take a look at the quad bird base. That's the entire name I have for it. Where you can really see that it starts from more like this, where the horizontals are valleys. And you also notice we have valley folds all along the diagonals, which really shows that it's a blinched water bomb / preliminary. So here's our water bomb if we collapse it here, but if we fold in these, I'm just gonna do one. If we fold in a corner, we get the, right, it'll start turning into this, which again, we're gonna show the kind of sequence to get this into a bird base on a quadrant. And now, why is this important? You might think I'm like rambling or this is very basic. Well, when you have this structure in an actual design, such as my generic Dragon V3, you can see the quad bird bases right here. Again, I call this generic dragon because it's a pretty common way to get a dragon mouth structure where you have 3 flaps here, and then 3 horns on each side, like split like this, and then the neck would continue onwards. And I'll show an example really quick of this dragon where you can see that happening, where the lighting, there you go. And so that is embedded right there. And when you have, I guess, like the rest of the model collapsed, because this isn't the first thing you do, I just want you guys to know how to do this like 100%, so you can replicate every time. You can see there's another bird base here. You can see that this is right, you can see this is very much designed based off of this preliminary base. Here's another bird base right here. It's basically bird bases stacked into sequential squares. And then small side comment, while this looks like it might be grid based and this looks like it's box pleat, I incorporated box pleat into it just because these are horizontal. They're not really grid lines, but all the reference points that we'll get into, while I have the crease pattern as it's basically thirds. The actual way I normally do these is using a different method with the bisector reference point. We'll talk about all that later. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a picture of what it means to use the base. The other crease pattern I showed, this is my origami fish. If you're familiar with that, where again, you can see the same pattern. Even though there's no mountain and valleys, you really don't need it. You can see that, okay, these two quadrants are bird bases. The rest of it, you know, we'll talk about that later. Don't worry about the middle. If that's just a sync fold, it's not quite flat foldable. I drew that really quickly. But yeah, so hopefully that gives a small grasp of everything we need to know. And let's get into this structure for the rest of this part. And I think that'll be good. And then in part 2, we'll start discussing what it means to do an actual design with the 22.5, how to find all the reference points to pre-crease, what are some of the steps you need to pre-crease, like see we have a bird base here, and then ultimately how to collapse the model and get it into this form. But yeah, let's get into it. All right, friends, so we're gonna start off with this structure, and the end goal will be the quad bird base, which I am just expanding a little bit so you can see what I mean by the quad bird base. Hopefully that makes sense if you folded a traditional crane before. But yeah, so we're gonna leave that there, and it matches the crease pattern. And then right here we have our kami, and it's just folded, you know, all the diagonals like this, and then so it forms a water bomb base. And our base for the quad bird base, instead of it just being a regular preliminary base, it's a blitzed preliminary base. So that means all these corners are folded to the center. And now I know I've been throwing around this term blintz, which the spelling's on screen, but it means that there's another flap adjacent to it. So you can have half blintz in many forms. So here you can have diagonal flap blintz, which is how my fish is. Tons of these variations, so you might see these in designs, and I encourage you to try to look for these in your designs. And while this video might not be enough to kind of get you there, just try and experiment and see if you can guess it right, and just compare the crease patterns and whatnot. But yeah, so I'm just going to show the sequence to get one of these bird bases into a already collapsed base. So say we have, actually let's just blintz one. So I'll show the blintz base like this. And then while something is collapsed, I'll show you how to both pre-crease and collapse it, which is mainly just a sequence, because you do not want to try pre-creasing everything shown here. It would just be a nightmare. And while what I mean by brute forcing would be, say, oh, I can, you know, fold the bisectors here, I can fold it here, but when you get to the middle, this is pretty insane. And since I'm teaching this class, telling you to brute force it would just be, you know, that wouldn't be me teaching the class. That'd be just bad. So while I know there might be some people out there that prefer to just pre-crease everything, try to learn the sequence, as this is like the way to learn it. Anyone could, you know, pre-crease everything and brute force the whole thing, but really try this exercise with the intention on learning the sequences behind these kind of design patterns. All right, so now that we have our blitzed base, let's actually just pretend we're going to do two flaps, because in our little lizard guy, we have two right next to each other right here. So that would resemble these kind of shifted like this. And they operate in a similar way. The pre-creasing will be similar. You'll see in the next videos when we get there, but this is definitely the prereq to practice. So while I'm only going to show one corner for the sake of time, I want you all to do all four corners just to practice. Maybe try sculpting a dragon head out of it. And yeah, there's plenty of origami dragons out there that use this design, so try to get experimental, you know, play around with it. But yeah, so we have our blinched, single corner blinched water bomb here. And don't worry about the terminology, just focus on this guy. So how do we turn this corner, which would just be a corner, into a bird base? And this is one of my favorite sequences. I find in diagrams a lot. But basically what you can do, whether it's already collapsed in the base, or if it's some flap that you have hanging off the side like this, is you can take this right here, and if you need to pre-crease it, you can, but you're going to squash fold the flap, just like this. Very reminiscent of tons of, you know, bases. I'm sure you've done this thousands of times. And you're going to petal fold upwards, which again, I'm sure you all have done many times, just like this. And you'll notice it's a little bit thicker since we're folding through both layers, as it is a blinched base, and that is intentional. So if you want to pre-crease it, you can. You want to have this precise. So I always use these as references if I need to. Oftentimes I don't do this pre-crease just because I trust my intuition on pushing these to the middle and creasing accurately, and then correcting if it doesn't lie flat. So even here, when I pre-crease, it's still not lying flat. So just make sure it's precise in your creasing. Get the flap in the middle, as we always want to be precise, especially since this is technically pre-creasing. All right, so get that all situated, and we'll be ready to go. Just like this. Pre-crease that flap down, and you all have done this many times. But now what we're going to do is I'm going to unfold this entire flap, and you'll see that this pre-creased the bird base for us. And we don't even have to collapse this yet. So even if you are in the stage of pre-creasing, if you knew that this corner was where you wanted to pre-crease a bird base, you have your bird base pre-creased. So we're going to be using that for this guy, and any other kind of 22.5 dragon or whatever you see a bird base shoved into a crease pattern. You're going to want to kind of do that sequence to pre-crease a bird base in the middle of a paper, or, you know, to the side of a paper or whatnot. It just is a really efficient way, keeps pre-creasing fast and fun. And there's a couple variations to this. You don't have to do it, but that is basically how you pre-crease a bird base. And our light just went out, so I'm just gonna swap the battery. We'll get back to collapsing this. All right, so now that we have our bird base pre-creased, how do we collapse this? Especially if the model is already kind of folded, like this. Our water bomb base. So now, since we unwrapped the flap from the blints, right? So we pre-creased it when it was like this. Now we're unwrapping it, and depending on the model, maybe you move on from this step, in which case you would unfold it completely, or maybe this is part of the sequence where you collapse it directly after pre-creasing. It's all pretty much the same. You rely on the creases we just made, which will automatically start squash folding this paper like this. If I push down on the diagonal, as you can see, both this part and this part are forming, and it squashes very nicely down like this. So on our crease pattern, that's basically these parts of it. And then the rest of it we have as this hanging flap. And then now this part, again, while it's not really shown on the crease pattern at times, we can fold it, just do a squash fold. And it looks almost like we have a full bird base, like we're doing a crane. And then we do the same petal fold for a traditional crane along our pre-creased lines, which will greatly assist us, especially on papers where you can't really just flip stuff like Kami very easily. But yeah, so right along those pre-creased lines, technically reversing creases, but boom, we have our bird base collapse into a corner. And I know that was pretty simple. Y'all might know all that already, but the principle of understanding when and where to pre-crease this will greatly help you when you're pre-creasing harder 22.5 degree crease patterns, or it might not even be a hard 22.5 degree crease pattern. They just might have weird reference points. So yeah, that'll help you out a ton. And I know this video was really long and I talked a ton, but great job for everyone who made it through. Practice this example. It's going to be really important to get this guy, and then you can still have some fun by turning it into like a dragon head, or just shaping it however you want. It could be like a 6-legged octopus. I'm not sure, or like a squid. But yeah, try that out. Try to understand this concept, and the next couple videos will be progressing into our cute little lizard guy. But yeah, so thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part 2. Should come out a couple days after this video here. And don't forget to like and subscribe so I can keep making these crease pattern tutorials for you all. Let me know what you think in the comments. Send me a photo on Instagram, whatever you guys want, and I'll try to answer you. So yeah, see you in part 2.
All this origami, all this origami, all this origami got me going kamikaze now.